let's get back to the big players of consequence. Alex Karaban back to UConn. Mark Sears back to Alabama. There's more big players we're going to get to, obviously, but these are the two key ones because they were decisions that are affecting teams that are in the top 5. Karaban, and I'll have more on this in a little bit as well. Like there are some decisions that came down on Wednesday and even Tuesday that were official, but like behind the scenes, when you talk to either coaches or NBA people, like these decisions were made for these players a couple weeks ago. They just waited until the final day to actually formally withdraw their paperwork, which they have the right to do. Karaban was not one of those. Karaban was a true 50-50. Sears, in my opinion, I have been of the running understanding that Mark Sears was returning to Alabama for a couple of weeks here, even if you wanted to take it to the very end. Karaban was 50-50. Had he gotten a first-round guarantee, I think he would have been gone. He did not get that. And now he is the only starter returning to the reigning national champions, and his is a key decision. I mean, to me, Karaban being back, it has UConn as a top 5 team being validated, particularly because that coaching staff also remains intact. Karaban averaged 13.3 points, 5.1 boards last season. Those numbers obviously expected to increase. He was not an All-American last season, but I would expect him to be a preseason All-American at CBSSports.com, be first, second, third team. He's going to be on that list. He started 77 games in his career, by the way. Your thoughts on Karaban's choice, Cobb, to opt to return to UConn, and in doing so, probably become the guy, but also now putting himself in a situation where he's going to be surrounded by some familiar faces, obviously, but the talent around him will not be quite as proven or evident at the same exact level going into a season the way it was the past 2 seasons in Stores.
Yeah, I had Alex Karaban mocked at 30. So I've been working on a mock that's coming out tomorrow. Have it done before the deadline. And I had Karaban at 30, but then I also had a contingency plan in place for if he withdrew and he's out. So I think it's huge for UConn because it gives them a returning starter. If Alex Karaban had stayed in the draft, they would have been replacing all 5 starters. And I don't think a three-peat is practical under those circumstances. Still highly unlikely, of course, that they could win 3 in a row, but I think they got a shot now with Alex Karaban back because while they do lose the other 4 starters, there is some continuity from within that rotation. Hassan Diarra, Solomon Ball, Samson Johnson. So I think it gives UConn a chance. I think without him, it would have been really far-fetched, but with Alex Karaban back, like let's have that three-peat conversation. I think it's within the realm of possibility.
We can definitely have the three-peat conversation about UConn now that Karaban is back. I had said on a previous show that if he didn't return, the prospect of UConn going 3 in a row without having a returning starter, again, nothing's ever impossible. And Hurley obviously burns on that kind of fuel, but him being back, I think, is so significant. And even still, folks, UCLA under Wooden was the teams that three-peated. Okay, so even still, it's going to be a monumental task. And this is, while I know the players won't look at it this way and the coaching staff won't look at it this way, everyone else outside of UConn, it is a house money situation this season. And it will be interesting to see how well they play and how well they go with it, having Karaban back in the mix. Again, Diarra being back, I think was major. Samson Johnson, he'll also play alongside Terrace Reed from Michigan, the big they got in the portal there. Aiden Mahaney was the big transfer get for them, and then obviously Liam McNeely coming in, 5-star freshman, top 10 in 247 Sports. It's a boon for UConn. Had they not had Karaban, they would have been a bigger question mark. They still would have gotten the rightful respect as being a preseason ranked team. I don't think we would have seen UConn, and I don't think it would have been justified to have UConn ranked preseason top 10 with no Karaban, but with him back, and he's a vocal, like Karaban is a really smart player, a vocal guy, a get it guy, and I think it means something significant for UConn's program to have him in the locker room a 3rd consecutive season, because he has played not only a key role on both the title teams, because he started most games as a freshman as well, obviously, but having been on a team in year 1 and a team in year 2 that were different, and now to be that leader, I think he's totally capable of doing it. And we'll see. I mean, if they're actually able to do it, he will be all-time legend status there. That's a big one for UConn, and a true 50-50 decision. And I love to see it. And we should also be applauding decisions like this, whereas like a lot of guys, understandably so, get a lot of attention for choosing to go in the draft. And sometimes that's the right decision. Sometimes it's not. I believe Karaban would have been drafted. I do. I'm very confident Karaban would have been a draft pick. Now, would it have been better than 40th, 45th? Maybe not. And with that, comes a different route to trying to make it in the NBA. If he returns, and if he is able to be an out-and-out star, potentially, what if he can get himself to be a lock first rounder? Then it was totally worth it there. But he is betting on himself just a little bit here, and I applaud the players that do this. There is still so much to be gained by playing another year in college basketball and making yourself better, even if it was more likely than not that you would have heard your name. I say on draft night. Reminder: it's now 2 nights, so it would have been the second night of draft night starting the season. The NBA draft, for reasons I don't understand whatsoever, will be 2 nights. Let's talk Mark Sears at Alabama. Alabama is now second in GP's top 25 and 1. Alabama, understandably so, even though I do, as longtime listeners know, Cobb, I abhor groupthink when it comes to offseason rankings. I do very much encourage diversity of thought. You are not going to get that with Alabama, and it's justified. They're going to be a preseason top 3 team. Some folks will have them 1, some will have them 2. GP's got them 2, some will have them 3. It's hard for me to get away from the notion that I'll have Bama outside the 3 whenever I got to do my big old rankings in the fall. Sears, and not Sears, Jaron Stevenson's back as well. Right. He returns, and getting them back with Grant Nelson, who returns. Latrell Wrightsell comes back. Sears was, 21.5 points per game. I've got his stat line here. What did he average last season? He was not only was he a bucket getter, 21.5 points, 4.2 rebounds, 4 assists, and shot 43% from 3-point range. He'll be a preseason first-team All-American, as he should be. They also got Cliff Amore in the transfer portal. He's big time from Rutgers, big defensive presence. Aiden Holloway from Auburn, former highly ranked prospect who was a bit player. We'll see if he can pop. And yes, he did cross enemy lines going from Auburn to Bama there, in addition to Chris Youngblood from South Florida, Houston Mallett from Pepperdine, who scored 15 a game. Alabama is a crew that is loaded all around. They make the Final Four. They lose after playing 30 competitive minutes against one of the best teams we've seen in the past few decades. Were you surprised by Sears' decision? Do you think Alabama should be even number 1? What are your thoughts on, in my opinion, the second most consequential decision of the past 24 hours? I think Karaban coming back to UConn is more consequential, but I think Sears is the 1B to that 1A because he will be in the mix to be National Player of the Year.
Well, I think Alabama would have been a preseason top 10 team even if Mark Sears had stayed in the draft, because of how well they've done in the transfer portal and because of what they bring back. But you bring him back, and I think you're now the clear-cut SEC favorite. There's a case for Alabama to be number 1 in the country right now. Mark Sears is just that guy. And Matt, do you remember last year you tried to shame me for having Mark Sears ahead of Isaiah Stevens in our top 101 players?
Oh, bring it back on me. That's what I love to hear there. Was I wrong by the end of the year? Sears better than Stevens?
I don't know. That's a tough debate, but I think because of
I did think that Stevens would definitely be better than Sears. I remember that. Yes, I do remember that in our top 101 players. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a prove-it year for Mark Sears. You go back to this time last year, it looked sometime around now that Javon Quinterly might go back to Alabama too. He ended up at Memphis, obviously. But man, you talk about addition by subtraction. The exact same thing happened for RJ Davis. You lose Caleb Love. Now all of a sudden those touches and those shots go to you, and you just explode. And that's what happened to Mark Sears. He lost his sidekick there in Quinterly, but it freed him up to be the guy, just like it freed RJ Davis up to be the guy at UNC. Now, the trick is you come back, the target's on your back. Everybody knows exactly who you are. They know what your spots are on the floor. You got some new players around you. So are you able to follow it up? That'll be tough. I kind of thought he might try to strike while the iron was hot in a relatively weak class. It's never going to be easy for an undersized guard to make it in the NBA. But if Mark Sears was ever going to get a 2-way contract or something like that, this might have been the year, especially getting all those Jalen Brunson comps as the undersized, left-handed, crafty scorer. But hey, it's all the better for college basketball. And that was one of my takeaways in my piece that I filed last night on the deadline day winners and losers, is that college basketball as a whole was a winner because we get Mark Sears back, we get Caleb Love back, and Alex Karaban as well. And these are players who, in the bygone era, pre-NIL, might not have gotten them back. So I think it's another example of how the changing nature of the sport lends itself to a little bit more star power in the game.
Yeah, we're going to get that more and more as the years go on. It's obviously a talking point worthy of bringing up here, but may get, just, oh, by the way, oh, matter of fact, in the years to come, and the fact that you've got well-known players. I mean, think about it. Karaban was an All-American, but he was a prominent player on a two-time national champion. And then Sears joins R.J. Davis, Caleb Love, former teammates, obviously, and Hunter Dickinson. So Sears, Love, Davis, Dickinson were 4 of our 15 All-Americans last season. That's a healthy ratio for the 15 most notable, accomplished, valuable, however you want to define it, players in men's college hoops last season are going to wind up coming back to the sport. And thusly, you'll have familiar faces there. And that doesn't even account for the fact that, Cooper Flagg mania, if you want to call it that, and everything that's associated with him and Duke, that will ratchet up, obviously, as we get closer and closer to the fall. So college hoops is in a perfectly fine and healthy place. It's not perfect, obviously. Many issues, some of which we've talked about on recent shows, and the House case coming down, and things that I think are not helping mid-major and low majors whatsoever in terms of financial commitments that they basically have no choice but to make. There's issues there. Still, unresolved tensions and uncertainties with the future of the NCAA tournament. Don't touch this damn thing, I swear to God. But overall, the sport is fairly healthy right now in terms of the product you are putting on the court and how fans are consuming it. When it's in recruiting, and we'll get to some of this in just a second here, it's chaotic. I mean, this has been the most stressful, chaotic situation behind the scenes for the sport and how it operates. But there's two things with that. One, that can be true, and we can have empathy to the people going through all that. But the reality is a lot of fans just simply don't care. They don't care about what's happening with that, only what players, their teams and coaches are getting so that they can be excited about their team. But one has connectivity to the other. Some of the issues that are tied to recruiting, the stresses with all that and the uncertainties, they can have impacts on how good your team is. I mean, we'll see if this comes to pass, but as things stand right now, I've had 2 people tell me in the past couple of days, just keep an eye out just in case, there's a chance that guys that went into the portal and committed to a program, there's a chance there might be a couple names that flip at some point in June here. So we'll see if that comes to pass, but there's a little bit of that out there as well. And it's certainly something to keep stock on. Bama, top 3 team heading into next season, going to be rated higher than the men's football team. I say men's football team going into the season. We brought this up. Someone had found me on this and I couldn't find it before today's show. I think, fact check me again, because I asked for some research on this. I think the number is 7 times. 7 times in history has the basketball program been rated higher than the football program heading into their respective seasons in the same calendar year. And the most recent instance of that was 06-07, when Bama was top 15 in football, wasn't even ranked overall. So kind of cool and good news for the Crimson Tide. Here's Parrish's top 10 right now, by the way. He's got KU 1, Bama 2, Houston 3, Carolina 4, UConn 5, Iowa State 6, Baylor 7, Gonzaga, which got a good commitment reaffirmed earlier this week with a player, Michael Ajayi, who was considering going into the draft. I never thought he would. Nevertheless, he's back at Gonzaga. Gonzaga's 8 on GP's list. Duke is 9. Auburn is 10. Let's talk a few other names here. As a rule of thumb for everyone watching and listening, once you get inside, call it 24 to 36 hours before the draft deadline, 90% of the time, if there's a player who has not publicly indicated one way or the other if he's going to stay in the draft or come back to college, most cases presume that player will return to college. There are exceptions every year, but overwhelmingly, if they get to the last day or two and they haven't decided, they're probably coming back. And that was the case here. The ones that wound up going that I wasn't surprised by were Deron Holmes out of Dayton. And then I saw a little bit of surprise from David Jones, thinking he might return to Memphis. I'm not saying I was dialed in all the way and I knew it. Just in talking to a few folks, I was of the running understanding that he was more likely to stay in the draft and come back to college. And that's obviously a big hit for Memphis. But those were the 2 that went. The 50-50s, Karaban came back. Coleman Hawkins, I would 50-50. And right now I'm told it's Arkansas that leads, but Louisville's in there, a major player, and Kansas State for Coleman Hawkins. Jameer Watkins.
Did you see Coleman Hawkins? He said, "I will never play in the Big Ten again.
Yes.
I wouldn't play in the Big East. I would go somewhere where I can enjoy a football game." So
okay.
Should we put Georgia on the list? I mean,
I have not heard Georgia associated with Coleman Hawkins.
I know, but good football. I mean,
yeah, that's true. That's true. Jameer Watkins was. I was told Jameer Watkins was like maybe the last person to withdraw his paperwork from the draft. Jameer Watkins is being heavily recruited by St. John's, Michigan, K-State, and I'm told there's a fourth mystery team in there. I don't know what the team is, but that is pretty interesting.
He's going to get paid like that. That's
yes.
we can really capitalize because most of those 6'7" two-way wings, those are the guys the NBA loves. They tend to be the ones, from what I can tell, who typically stay in the draft pool. So now that you got a guy with that sort of talent and upside in the transfer portal, and you got 36 teams that still want to add to their rosters, I feel like he's going to really clean up from the NIL side.
Yeah, he was an honorable mention All-ACC at Florida State last season. FSU obviously had a lost season. Other 50-50s that came back, Hunter Salas back at Wake, Jaron Stevenson back at Bama, Jackson Robinson, now he goes from BYU to UK. The 50-50s, or I'm sorry, the other players that decided to come back that I was of the understanding for a while now that they were Caleb Love, Janelle Davis, Matthew Morrell back at Ole Miss, Nick Clifford, Colorado State, Ugana Onyenso back. He's on the Awuga Poplar's on the market. Onyenso's on the market. I think K-State's a heavy favorite for Onyenso. Peyton Sandfort back at Iowa, Chase Hunter back at Clemson, then Arthur Kaluma on the market there. So I gave you a bunch of names there. We can lead on Love if you want. Obviously, him returning to Arizona is pretty significant. Wildcats also lost a couple players because of this, but they will have a preseason top 10 case. Any of the guys that I brought up here, either going, staying, otherwise, that kind of stand out the most to you?
Well, you might not have been surprised that David Jones stayed in the draft, but I think Penny Hardaway may have been, because he put the odds a couple of weeks ago during a speaking engagement in Memphis at 70-30 David Jones returns. And obviously that's not the way that one played out. Then another one that stood out to me, not because it was surprising in the moment yesterday, but because if you had told me in November or December this was going to happen, I would have been pretty surprised by that. And then just an example of how his stock rose. Johnny Furphy staying in the draft.
Yeah, that's another one. But sorry to interrupt you. That was assumed for weeks. I don't know why it took this long, but people thought that he was gone. So, and that was just only reaffirmed there by him not returning to Kansas.
Sure, absolutely. But really incredible how his stock rose sort of by default because of the situation Kansas was in from a roster situation. Johnny Furphy had no choice but to play 30 minutes a game as a true freshman who had been a late enrollee as an international prospect. He came in as somebody who was clearly going to need a lot of seasoning, and he still kind of does. But another example of how a weak draft class sets itself up for a guy like that to potentially go in the first round.
Yeah, that's 2 years in a row with Kansas having two, tall white wings go one and done unexpectedly. Grady Dick the year before, and then obviously Furphy here, and good on Furphy for being able to capitalize, but that was not expected whatsoever there. Caleb Love going back to Arizona again. Let's celebrate the move. He's always something of an opera, but in terms of his play and what he contributes, and sometimes how games can go. But I thought one of the more under discussed, and maybe not on the pod, we tried to address this at least a couple times, but like, there were no issues, as far as I can tell, with Caleb Love and his new environment last season at Arizona. His last game in the tournament was obviously an abomination, and you don't want to see that. That was not good in the Sweet 16. But on the whole, like, Tommy Lloyd and that staff recruited him to that spot. Had serious conversations about what his role would be. He said he was going to buy in. He bought in. He wanted to go through the pre-draft process. Had never done it. Didn't quite have enough. No assurances that he would have been drafted. So yeah, one more year with the Wildcats there. And they moved to the Big 12. I actually think it's pretty significant. Our poll results right now, what's the most significant decision of the past 24 hours or so? Karaban leads. Karaban to UConn, 36%. Sears, 30%. Other, 26%. Caleb Love, just 7%. Folks, Caleb Love, fourth there. Without Love on Arizona's roster, I don't know if I would have had the Wildcats in the top 20. And now that he's there, I think Arizona has a chance maybe to be top 10 status. So that's some interesting response there. What are your thoughts on, on that poll result, Cobb, and also Caleb Love going back to Tucson?
Yeah, I really, really, really want to see a Caleb Love versus RJ Davis, Arizona versus North Carolina Elite Eight game. Like, I want that so bad to see those guys go head to head. It would just be fantastic theater. I think it's obviously big for Arizona, but at the same time, like Tommy Lloyd's done a pretty good job building that roster. And Jaden Bradley is one of those guys who I think is going to have an increased role regardless because, Kylan Boswell and Pella Larson are gone. But if Caleb Love had stayed in the draft, like he's somebody who could have crept up into all conference type of territory next season because he's bided his time. He's played a bit role at Alabama, a bit role at Arizona, again, in line for an increased role. But if they had lost Caleb Love, I would have loved to have seen what Jaden Bradley could have done in a more featured role. But obviously you get a score like Caleb Love back. That's cause for celebration.
Yeah, no, it's a good get. It's a big get. Caleb Love, I think, has a chance to be an All-American again next season, and how he fits in with the pieces around him. Trey Townsend coming from Oakland, I think that's a significant add for Arizona. Horizon League Player of the Year. I think he's got a sneaky chance to be among the 5 most impactful and what was a huge transfer market. So I don't want to overstate it. I'm not guaranteeing it, but if you told me that with how Lloyd coaches and Townsend's game, I think there's a chance there, and for Love to thrive alongside of him. And then I want to see Jaden Bradley improve as well there. So that's a pretty big one. I think decisions like Nick Clifford coming back to Colorado State are pretty massive. Morrell back at Ole Miss is pretty massive. Like, you've got a few decisions here. Think about it. Morrell, Miss, Salas at Wake Forest, Sanford at Iowa. These are teams that did not make the tournament last year and now can have some real hope that they can get there, and in large part because of these kind of decisions there. So fan bases were no doubt on a little bit of edge, but some of these were, in my estimation, some of these decisions, if not made by the players, again, the decisions got made for them by the NBA teams. I mean, I'm not going to say which player specifically, but I talked to someone earlier today, and one of the players we've talked about on this show did a number of workouts with teams, 4 or 5 teams, and every single one of the teams, trying to give honest, objective counsel to these players and the representation, said, we won't draft you, and we don't see why you will be drafted. So you'd be best by returning to college there. And again, applaud the guys that opt to come back and take that advice and